A gunshot in a VIP hospital corridor. A man bleeding out on marble floors. A nurse who ran toward the danger instead of away from it. Dr. Zuri Bennett didn't know she was resuscitating the most feared crime boss in all of Korea. She didn't know his enemies were still in the building. She didn't know that saving his life would cost her everything she thought she understood about safety, freedom, and herself. One decision in the dark changed everything. Now she's locked inside a fortress, and the man who put her there is the only person standing between her and a bullet. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The rain came down hard that night, the kind that turned Seoul's streets into black mirrors and made the city feel like it was trying to drown itself. Inside Hansung Premier Medical Center, the fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent hum, and the VIP corridor on the 14th floor smelled the way expensive hospitals always smelled, like antiseptic and money, like the kind of clean that cost more than most people made in a year. Dr. Zuri Bennett had been on her feet for 11 hours. She was 31 years old, originally from Atlanta, and she had come to Seoul on a 2-year contract that her mother back home still didn't fully understand. Her mother had said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, "Baby, why Korea?" And Zuri had said, "Because they offered me the position," which was true, and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had needed to go somewhere far enough that her old life couldn't follow her. She hadn't explained that part. She was a trauma nurse with credentials that made attending physicians twice her age pay attention when she walked into a room. She had fast hands and a faster mind and a way of staying completely level when everything around her was falling apart, which was in trauma medicine the only skill that actually mattered. She'd learned it young, under circumstances that had nothing to do with a hospital, but she'd learned it. Tonight she was running supply checks in the East Wing storage room, which was tedious work. The kind of work that nobody important wanted to do at 11:30 at night, but that somebody had to do. She was counting IV bags and thinking about nothing when she heard it. The sound was wrong. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where she'd learned to recognize the sound of a suppressed gunshot before she'd learned to drive. This was that sound, the flat, wet punch of it, muffled, but not muffled enough, followed by the specific quality of silence that comes after violence, not the regular quiet, the held breath kind. She stood still for 3 full seconds, which was longer than it sounds. Then she moved toward it instead of away from it, because that was simply who she was, regardless of whether it was smart. The VIP corridor was empty when she turned the corner, which felt wrong. There should have been at least one security guard at the far end, a heavy-set man named Officer Park, who sometimes shared his vending machine coffee with her during overnight shifts. He wasn't there. The corridor was a long stretch of cream-colored walls and recessed lighting and closed doors, and at the far end, outside room 1407, there was a smear of something dark on the floor that hadn't been there an hour ago. Zuri walked toward it. The man was on the floor just inside the doorway, partially blocking the door from closing. He was Korean, somewhere in his late 30s, and he was wearing a shirt that had probably cost more than her monthly rent, which was now soaked through on the left side with blood that was still moving. Moving meant the heart was still working. His eyes were closed. His breathing, when she crouched down and put her ear close, was there, barely, shallow and skipping, the kind of breathing that was arguing with itself about whether to continue. She didn't think about who he was. She thought, airway, breathing, circulation. She pulled the door fully open and dragged him clear of the frame by his shoulders, which took more effort than it should have because he was built like he'd spent considerable portions of his life being physically difficult to move. She got him flat on his back and found the wound, entry point just below the left shoulder. No visible exit, which meant the bullet had made a decision to stay. She pressed her palm hard against it and felt his body register the pressure even through unconsciousness. His face tightened, his jaw set, then his breathing stopped. Zuri said, under her breath, something that wasn't a prayer and wasn't a curse, but existed somewhere in between those two things, and she started chest compressions. She counted them out loud because that was what you did. The counting kept you anchored, kept the rhythm from falling apart. She got to 12 compressions and tilted his head back and breathed into him and felt the resistance in his chest and pushed through it and kept going. On the second breath, his hand came up and locked around her wrist with a speed and precision that was not the movement of a man who'd been clinically dead 12 seconds ago. She froze. His eyes were open. Dark. Completely still. The kind of eyes that had been trained to give nothing away, and had been doing it for so long that nothing came out even when he wasn't trying. He looked at her face with an expression that she could not read at all, which was, she would later realize, genuinely unusual for her. She could usually read people. He said, in English that was accented but completely precise, "Who are you?" Not a question, a demand that had been shaped into the grammar of a question. "I'm a nurse," she said, "and I need you to let go of my wrists so I can keep you from dying." He held on for another 2 seconds. She counted them, and then released her wrist with a deliberateness that made it clear he was letting go rather than being forced to. She went back to work immediately, pressing her palm against the wound, assessing with her other hand, thinking about what she had access to and what she didn't, and whether she could get him stable enough to move. "There are men in this building," he said, from the floor, in the same flat, precise tone he might have used to discuss the weather. "I know, I heard the shot." "More than one shot." She looked up at him. "How many?" At least 3 distinct entry points were compromised. They came in through the maintenance level. He paused. He was breathing with visible effort, but his eyes remained completely focused. "They will not leave witnesses." "Then we need to call security. Security is already dead." He said it without any particular inflection. "The men who did this are professionals. If you are here when they find this room, you will not survive it." Zuri looked at him. She looked at the blood coming through her fingers. She looked at the empty corridor behind her and thought about Officer Park, who'd shared his coffee with her, and felt something cold move through her chest that she refused to let reach her face. "Can you stand?" she said. "Yes." "I don't believe you, but we're going to try anyway." Getting him to his feet took 45 seconds and cost him enough that she could see the effort in the lines around his mouth, the white pressure of his jaw. He stood. He was taller than she'd registered from the floor, significantly taller than her, broad through the shoulders, and he stood with a stillness that didn't match how much blood he'd lost. He put one hand against the wall and she put herself under his right arm and they moved. She didn't know where she was going. She was operating on the principle of a way, which in a building with active shooters was at least a direction. She took him down the service corridor that ran parallel to the main hall, the one she knew because she'd used it 300 times to move equipment without blocking patient traffic. She was thinking about the stairwell at the north end, thinking about whether the maintenance level was actually compromised or whether he'd been estimating, thinking about how much blood loss a man his size could sustain before the math stopped working in his favor. They heard them before they saw them. Footsteps. Controlled, patterned. The footsteps of men who had done this kind of moving before. 2 sets at minimum, coming from the south end of the corridor she'd just left. She pushed through a door into a linen storage room, and they stood in the dark among shelving units of folded sheets, and she put her hand back against his wound and felt him breathe. Felt it with her palm. Slow. Deliberate. Not the breathing of a man in panic. Whatever he was, fear didn't work on him the way it worked on other people. From outside the door, they heard the footsteps pass, heard voices, low and in Korean, and she caught 2 words she recognized from 14 months of living in Seoul, words that translated roughly to confirm and clean. She understood what that meant in context. They waited 4 minutes. She counted. Then he said quietly, "There is an exit on the west side of this floor. A loading bay. My vehicle will have been notified." "Your vehicle." "My driver. He monitors certain frequencies. When my signal goes dark, he repositions to the secondary extraction point." He paused. "It is a protocol." Zuri thought about the word protocol. Thought about what kind of man had extraction protocols built into his medical appointments. Thought about the suppressed gunshots and the dead security guard and the men in the corridor saying clean. She said, "Who are you?" He looked at her in the dark for a moment. "Kang Tae-hyun," he said. The name meant nothing to her in that moment, which was, she would later understand, the last moment in which her ignorance would be available to protect her. They made it to the loading bay. The vehicle was there, a black SUV, engine running, a man behind the wheel who did not look like a driver, the way that an iceberg does not look like most of its own mass. He took one look at Tae-hyun's condition, and his jaw tightened, and he said something sharp in Korean that Tae-hyun answered in 2 words. And then the door was open, and they were inside, and the vehicle was moving before Zuri had fully processed the sequence of events that had deposited her into it. She spent the ride doing what she could with what she had, which was limited. She used her sweater and her own hands and the first aid kit she found under the rear seat, and she kept pressure on the wound and monitored his breathing and watched his color and said, with professional calm that she was manufacturing from somewhere, "You need a hospital. I have just left a hospital. You need a different one with an operating theater, and someone who knows what they're doing with a—" "There is a physician at the compound," he said. "Dr. Lim. He is competent. The bullet is still inside you. I am aware of that. Are you aware that depending on where it's sitting, you could be—" "Yes." He turned his head and looked at her with those flat, unrevealing eyes. "I am aware of every relevant fact about my current condition, Dr. Bennett, Zuri Bennett." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away, out the rain-streaked window at the Seoul street sliding past. "You ran toward the shot," he said. "Not an accusation, something else. I'm a nurse. Many nurses would not." She didn't have an answer for that she wanted to give him, so she went back to the wound and kept her hands busy and said nothing. The compound was not what she expected, which meant she had been expecting something, which meant some part of her had already assembled enough information to form an expectation. She'd been expecting something fortified and cold, something institutional. What she got was a property behind high walls in the kind of quiet residential area of Seoul that cost a number she couldn't fully conceptualize. And inside the walls it was not warm exactly, but deliberately constructed. Buildings of dark wood and steel, a courtyard with trees she'd later learn were cherry trees, currently bare and rain-slicked, standing in the lit courtyard like they were waiting for something. They took him from her at the entrance, 2 men and a woman in medical scrubs, organized and efficient, a stretcher appearing from somewhere. And then Tae-hyun was gone, and she was standing in the rain in the courtyard with blood on her hands, and her sweater gone, and a man she didn't know standing 6 feet away watching her with the specific patience of someone who has been assigned to watch. "I need to clean up," she said. He nodded and gestured toward a door. She followed him because there was nothing else to follow. They put her in a room that was the size of her entire Seoul apartment, with a private bathroom and a window that looked out onto the courtyard. There were clothes laid out on the bed, her size, she noted, which she chose not to think too hard about. There was a towel, there was hot water. She stood in the shower for longer than she should have and let the water run over her hands until the last of it ran clear. And then she stood with her back against the tile wall and breathed for a while. She was not panicking. She had made a decision a long time ago about panic. It was not something she could afford, so she had developed over years an internal structure that kept it at a particular arm's length. She could see it from where she stood. Panic? She was aware of it. But it was over there and she was over here. And as long as she kept moving and thinking, that distance maintained itself. She dried off. She put on the clothes, dark, expensive, too well fitted for coincidence. She sat on the edge of the bed and took stock of what she knew. She was inside a walled compound in a part of Seoul she hadn't fully tracked during the drive. The door to her room was, when she'd tested it on the way to the bathroom, locked. Her phone had been in her locker at the hospital, which she had not retrieved when they'd left, which meant she had no phone. She had her hospital ID badge clipped to her ruined sweater, now presumably in a bin somewhere. She had in total herself. She went to the window. The courtyard was quiet now, the rain still coming down. The bare cherry trees standing in their patient way. 2 figures moved in the shadows near the main building. Men whose movement told her they were not walking to get from one place to another, but walking to maintain a perimeter. She cataloged that. She cataloged the height of the outer wall, visible from her angle, and the light placement. And the fact that there appeared to be 1 camera she could see directly, and probably 2 she couldn't. Then she sat back down on the bed. She thought about what she knew about Kang Tae-hyun, which was still, at this point, nothing more than a name. She thought about the gunshots and the systematic way the men in the corridor had been moving and the word clean. She thought about the fact that someone had tried to kill him in a hospital, which was either an act of remarkable boldness or an act of desperation, and those 2 things pointed toward different kinds of enemies. She thought about this doctor on the other side of the compound doing, presumably, what she herself would be doing if she had the equipment. Removing a bullet and managing a wound and arguing with a patient who didn't believe pain was an adequate reason to hold still. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, and looked at the ceiling, and she was tired enough that sleep came for her faster than she expected, And the last thing she thought before it pulled her under was that she had no idea yet how much her life had just changed, and that she probably should. She woke to gray light coming through the window, and the sound of the courtyard below settling into morning. For a moment, between sleep and waking, she was in her apartment, and the gray light was normal soul morning light, and she had nothing to navigate. Then full consciousness arrived, and the room reassembled itself around her, and she sat up. The door was still locked. She used the bathroom, used the toothbrush that had been left out, which, again, she noted, and found, when she'd finished, that a tray had been placed on the small table near the window at some point while she was in the bathroom. Coffee, dark, and in a proper cup, not instant. Rice and a soft-boiled egg and small dishes of things she recognized from 14 months of eating Korean breakfasts. A folded piece of paper under the edge of the tray that said, in careful English, Dr. Bennett, you will be spoken with this morning. Eat, not a request. She ate. The coffee was actually good, which she found somehow annoying because it made the situation harder to be righteously angry about. She sat by the window and watched the courtyard come alive in a slow way. A woman moving between the buildings with a clipboard, two men doing what appeared to be a security walkthrough, a man in his 60s tending to one of the trees with quiet, unhurried attention. At 8:15, a knock on the door, and then the door unlocking from outside. The man who entered was not Kang Tae-hyun. He was older, perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now something more interesting than handsome. All plains and experience, silver-haired, wearing a suit that was European in cut. He moved through the room like a man who was comfortable in rooms, which meant like a man who was comfortable with power, which was its own particular language of movement. Dr. Bennett, he said. His English was excellent. I am Director Min Suk-jin. I oversee operations for Kang Group. He settled into the chair across from her without being invited, and she stayed on the edge of the bed and they regarded each other. How is he? She said. Seok-jin looked faintly surprised, which she suspected was a rare expression on his face. Stable, he said. Dr. Lim removed the projectile successfully. He will require rest and monitoring, but the prognosis is favorable. The projectile was sitting against the scapula, she said. If it had been 1.5 millimeters further medial, it would have found the subclavian artery, and he'd have bled out in the time it took me to get him to that loading bay. He was lucky. Yes, said Seok-jin. He studied her with an attention that was careful and thorough in a way that had nothing to do with admiration. He was also fortunate that you were present. That's one word for it. You are wondering, he said, whether you are here voluntarily. The door was locked. A precaution. Given the events of last night, we needed to verify your identity and your connection, if any, to the parties responsible. He folded his hands in his lap. We take security seriously. That's apparent, she said, given that someone shot your employer in a hospital. Seok-jin's expression didn't change, but something around his eyes tightened. Yes, he said, given that. Did they get whoever did it? That is being addressed. What about the hospital staff? A pause. The particular quality of that pause told her something. The incident has been managed, Seok-jin said. She looked at him and understood that managed was a word that covered a geography she wasn't going to be permitted to enter, and she understood that pushing on it right now was not going to produce anything useful. She filed it. So what happens to me, she said. That depends, in part, on you, he said, on what we learn about you, and on what Mr. Kang decides. Mr. Kang, she said, is currently recovering from a gunshot wound. The decisions being made about my situation shouldn't rest on a man who needs to be lying still and not activating his sympathetic nervous system. Nevertheless, said Seok-jin, they do. He left her with that. The investigation of her, she would learn later, was thorough in ways that would have felt violating if she'd known about it in real time. Background checks in 2 countries. Her social media, her bank records, her hospital performance reviews, her lease agreement for her sole apartment, the transcript of her nursing license application, the insurance claim she'd filed 2 years ago when someone had hit her parked car in Atlanta. They examined her the way a jeweler examines a stone, methodically, under pressure, looking for fractures. She spent the first day in the room, which she used to do inventory. She was good at inventory, good at taking a space apart with her eyes and understanding its logic. The room was a guest suite, not a cell, but the distinction was definitional rather than practical given the locked door. She assessed. The window opened enough to ventilate, but not enough to climb through. The bathroom had no external access. The furniture was substantial enough to suggest it had been chosen for aesthetics, rather than repurposed from somewhere that prioritized other things. What the room told her was that this was a place accustomed to hosting people who were guests, in the way that complicated obligations were guests. Welcomed, treated well, not entirely free to leave. In the afternoon, a different man brought her lunch and told her briefly that she was welcome to the books on the shelf if she wanted them. She looked at the shelf. It held a diverse collection in Korean, English, and Japanese that suggested the room's previous occupants had been various and literate. She took a novel in English, a crime novel, which she recognized had a particular appropriateness to her current situation, and sat by the window and read, but she was also watching the courtyard, the patterns of movement, the way the security rotation worked, and the fact that there was one guard who walked slightly favoring his left side, which was either an old injury or a current one, and which meant that in a physical confrontation, he had a particular vulnerability. She wasn't planning to run. She was just collecting. The second morning, the door was unlocked. No explanation. She tested it by opening it, found a hallway, found a man positioned unobtrusively near the stairwell who nodded at her with the universal nod of someone who is telling you that yes, you may move, but no, you are not unaccompanied. She moved. She found the kitchen, where a woman she hadn't met looked up from a cutting board without surprise and pointed at the coffee machine with her knife, which Zuri interpreted as an invitation and acted on accordingly. She was standing with her coffee by the window that overlooked a different part of the courtyard when she heard him. She heard him before she saw him. The particular pattern of footsteps, slightly altered from what she imagined they normally were. The subtle compensation of a man managing pain he was refusing to acknowledge. She turned as he came into the kitchen, dressed simply, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who has been told to take it easy and has made a private decision about how much of that advice to follow. He looked better than he had any right to look, which she suspected was characteristic. He stopped when he saw her, and there was something in that stop. Not surprise exactly, more like the recalibration of someone who had been told a fact, but is now processing the physical reality of it. "You're up," she said. "I was told you were contained," he said, looking at the coffee in her hand. The door was unlocked. He looked toward the stairwell. Some silent communication happened with the guard she couldn't see, and then he looked back at her. "Dr. Lim says the shoulder blade will heal fully," she said, "assuming you don't do something catastrophically stupid like come downstairs before you're supposed to." "I don't do catastrophically stupid things," he said. "You got shot in a hospital." He looked at her for a long moment. Something passed through those flat eyes, something that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, the ghost of something that might have been a smile in a different life. "Sit down," she said, pulling out a chair. Let me look at the dressing." "Dr. Lim doesn't know you put weight on that shoulder in the stairwell just now. I heard it." She put her coffee down and gave him a direct look. "Sit down, Mr. Kang." He sat. She moved behind him and checked the dressing. It was clean, properly applied, and he'd done no damage on the stairwell. The weight bearing had been minimal, but she took her time. She was close enough to note things, the way his shoulders carried tension even in rest, the surgical scar high on his right forearm that was years old, the fact that his breathing was controlled in a way that was trained rather than natural. "Who operated on your shoulder before?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What?" "Your left shoulder. It's not this wound this is new. I'm talking about the surgical scarring around the acromioclavicular joint. Someone went in there approximately 8 to 10 years ago, based on scar maturity. They did mediocre work." She straightened. "It's part of why you're compensating on that side. The rotation is slightly off. Whoever did it didn't properly account for the joint mechanics." He turned and looked at her from the chair. This time the look was different. Not the flat assessment, but something that was making a decision about her without announcing it. "How do you know that?" he said. "From standing behind me for 30 seconds. 22, she said. "And I watch how people move. It's how I assess. I don't need imaging if the body's already telling me what happened to it." He held her gaze for a moment longer. "A doctor in Tokyo," he said. "A long time ago." She nodded and went back to her coffee. "You should do targeted physical therapy. I can give you exercises that would help with the rotation if—" She stopped herself. "If that's something that's relevant. Given." She gestured at the room, at the compound, at the general situation. "Given," he said. They sat in the kitchen for a while in the quiet. The woman with the cutting board had left at some point. The rain was still coming down outside, lighter now, barely a mist against the glass, and the cherry trees in the courtyard were still bare and dripping and patient. "Am I your prisoner?" Zuri said. He didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the trees. "The situation is complex," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It isn't." He looked back at her. "You are here because you were present at an event that cannot be unwitnessed. The people who arranged that event are still unidentified. Until they are identified, everyone connected to last night is a potential vulnerability. Including me. Including you. So I'm here for my protection," she said flatly. "Among other reasons." "What other reasons?" He looked at her steadily. "I don't yet know whether you are who you appear to be." She looked back at him with equal steadiness. "I'm a trauma nurse from Atlanta who was doing supply inventory when someone tried to kill you. That's the whole story. People who mean to do harm often have simple stories. People who mean to do harm also usually don't perform CPR on the target," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. "No," he said after a moment. "They usually don't." She held his gaze. "Mr. Kang, I didn't choose any part of last night. I heard a shot. I went toward it. I found a man who wasn't breathing, and I did my job. Everything that happened after that happened to me, not because of me." She put her coffee cup down on the counter. "I understand you have reasons to be suspicious of everyone. Based on what I've seen in the last 18 hours, that's probably a rational policy. But I'd appreciate it if you kept it factual and told me what I'm actually dealing with here, instead of speaking in frames." He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the mist rain moved through the courtyard in slow curtains. "You will be here," he said finally, "until my people have completed their assessment of the situation. When they do, we will speak again." He stood carefully. "The compound is available to you within certain areas. You will be shown which areas. You will not be locked in. And if your assessment decides I'm a problem, then we will discuss that when it becomes relevant." He moved toward the door. She watched him and noted that he was managing the stairs he'd come down better than he'd managed them coming, which meant he'd adjusted his gait in the short time between then and now, which meant he was adaptable in his body the same way she suspected he was adaptable in everything. "Mr. Kang," she said. He stopped. "Whoever shot you last night knew your schedule, your room number, the hospital's layout. They came in through maintenance, which means someone gave them access, or they had someone inside." She said it the way she said everything, level, direct, without performance. "If your people are trying to identify the threat from the outside in, they're starting at the wrong end." He turned back to look at her. "The person who arranged this," she said, "is someone who already knows everything about you." The quality of his stillness in that moment was unlike anything she had encountered before. It was not the stillness of someone absorbing a shock. It was the stillness of someone confirming something they had already, in the private architecture of their own mind, begun to suspect. He looked at her for a long moment and she couldn't read him, which still unsettled her, and then he said, "Get some rest, Dr. Bennett," and left. She stood in the kitchen alone with her coffee and the rain and the cherry trees and the particular feeling of having just handed someone a piece of information that was going to change the shape of things, even though she didn't yet fully understand what things those were. That afternoon, a man named Dong Hyun, who was young and businesslike and clearly uncomfortable with the ambiguity of his assignment, showed her the areas of the compound she was permitted to access. The main building, kitchen, common areas, the east corridor on the ground floor, the courtyard within its walls, a small library that she was told Mr. Kong used in the evenings and which was therefore, during those hours, not available to her. She noted that restriction without commenting on it. She spent the afternoon in the courtyard despite the lingering damp because she needed air and movement and the kind of spatial awareness that only came from being in a place physically. She walked the perimeter slowly. She counted her paces. She looked at the walls and the gate and the cameras. She was not planning to escape. She was doing what she always did, which was understand where she was. One of the bare cherry trees had a split in its lower trunk that had been mended with what appeared to be careful, patient work. Some kind of resin or compound worked into the fissure, the bark smooth over it, the tree continuing upward as if the damage had been cosmetic. She stood and looked at it for a while. On her third pass around the courtyard, she became aware that she was being watched from the window of the east corridor. She didn't look directly. She kept walking, but she catalogued it. That evening, Dong-hyun brought her dinner and told her, slightly stiffly, that Mr. Kang had requested her presence in the library for 30 minutes if she was willing. The if was interesting. She said yes. He was at the desk when she arrived, reading, which she hadn't expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. He looked up when she came in, closed the book. She clocked the cover, Economic Theory in Korean, and gestured to the chair across from him. "I owe you an answer," he said. "To which question?" "To the one about whether you're a prisoner." He sat back. "You are not, but I'm asking you to remain here voluntarily until the situation is resolved, for your own safety." "How long?" "I don't know yet." "That's honest, at least." "I don't lie," he said, "not as a policy. It wastes time." She looked at him. "Your director, Min Suk-jin, he was here this morning." "Yes." "He said the incident at the hospital was managed." Tae-hyun's face told her nothing. "The nurse who was on that corridor," she said. "A man named Park Jae-won. He always walked to the south end of the VIP floor at the start of every hour. He wasn't there last night. I need to know if he's okay." Something shifted, barely, but she caught it. "I'll look into it," he said. "I'd like a direct answer." "I don't have one yet," he said. "I will get you one." She held his gaze. "Thank you." They sat in the library for the 30 minutes that had been allotted, and then a few minutes beyond that without either of them acknowledging it, and she watched him move through the room, to the window, to refill a glass of water, back to the desk. And she catalogued it all, the shoulder compensation, the way he held himself, the careful management of a body that had been through more than it should have and was doing it anyway, and she thought, he has been alone with all of this for a very long time. She didn't say that. She left when the time felt right, and went back to her room and lay on the bed in the dark and listened to the compound settle into night around her. And she thought about the hole in his shoulder and the man in his kitchen who'd looked at her like she was something that required a decision, and the trees in the courtyard waiting for their season, and somewhere underneath all of it, a question that was beginning to form at the edges of her mind, shapeless still but persistent. Who, inside these walls, had told someone exactly which hospital room to send the men with the guns to? Outside, the mist had become proper rain again. The cherry trees stood in the dark, bare and patient, and the compound's lights reflected off the wet stones of the courtyard. And somewhere in the east corridor a door opened and closed softly, at an hour when it shouldn't have, and Zuri Bennett lay in the dark with her eyes open and her mind moving and understood, with the precision that had always been her particular quality, that the danger in this place was not finished. It had only just begun to show her its face. 3 days passed before Zuri learned that Park Jae-won was dead. Tae-hyun told her himself, which she hadn't expected. He came to the kitchen in the early morning the way he'd started doing. She'd noticed the pattern on day 2, the way his internal clock pushed him downstairs before 6, regardless of what his body needed. And he poured his coffee, and he stood at the window and he said without preamble, "The guard, Park Jae-won. He was found in the maintenance level the night of the incident. He didn't survive." Zuri was quiet for a moment. She had her hands around her own cup, and she kept them there, kept the warmth against her palms. "Did he have family?" she said. "A wife? 2 sons." She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it because there wasn't anything else to say that would help, and she had learned early that the things that didn't help were best kept internal. But she felt it move through her. The particular weight of it, a man who'd shared vending machine coffee with her, gone now, the specific and unrepeatable fact of him erased. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Tae-hyun said nothing. He looked out at the courtyard where the morning light was coming in flat and gray through the clouds, and his jaw was set in that way it had when he was holding something in, and she understood that he was not indifferent to it either. She didn't know yet what to do with that understanding, so she left it where it was. That was day 4. By day 6, the compound had started to feel like a geography she lived in rather than one she was navigating. She knew which floorboards creaked on the east corridor. She knew that the kitchen woman, whose name was Mrs. O, she'd learned, and who communicated primarily through the direction of her knife and the quality of her silences, kept the good tea in the second cabinet and the mediocre tea in the first as a kind of screening mechanism for guests she hadn't decided about yet. She knew that the security rotation changed at 6, at 2, and at 10, and that the guard with the bad left leg was named Song Min, and that his limp worsened in cold weather, which had implications for how effectively he could run. She wasn't planning to run, she was just collecting. She had also, by day 6, made herself useful in ways that nobody had asked her to, and nobody could reasonably object to. She had restocked the medical supplies in the compound's small treatment room, reorganizing them from a system that had clearly been designed by someone whose medical training was logistical rather than clinical. She had assessed 2 of the compound staff for minor injuries, one man with a hand laceration that needed proper closure rather than the butterfly strip someone had slapped on it, one woman who'd been managing what she called shoulder stiffness, but which Zuri diagnosed in 30 seconds as early-stage bursitis. She had not asked permission to do these things. She had simply done them. On day 6, she also began to understand the compound's internal temperature. It was beneath the surface professionalism and the organized movement and the complete structural loyalty that everyone here operated with, a place running on tension. She had been in enough high-pressure environments to recognize it. Not the tension of crisis, which was acute and readable, but the tension of people who knew something was wrong and didn't know from which direction it was coming, and who therefore moved through their days with a specific kind of alertness that was exhausting to sustain and impossible to put down. Everyone in this compound was waiting for something. She was in the courtyard on the afternoon of day 7, sitting on the stone bench near the mended cherry tree, when Seokjin appeared. She hadn't seen him since the first morning. He moved across the courtyard with the ease of a man in his own territory, which she supposed it technically was, and he lowered himself into the seat across from her with the precise social calibration of someone who had been managing dynamics between powerful people for decades. "How are you finding your stay, Dr. Bennett?" he said. "Informative," she said. He looked at her with those careful eyes. "Mr. Kang tells me you've been assisting with medical matters." "I'm a nurse. It's what I do." "Yes." He paused. "He also tells me your background check was completed 2 days ago. Clean." "I told you it would be." "Most people say that." He settled back. "Few are correct." She looked at him. In the flat afternoon light, his face was easier to read than it had been in the dimness of her room that first morning. And what she read in it now was a kind of watchful pleasantness that was the social equivalent of a locked door. Everything accessible on the surface, nothing actually accessible underneath. "So I can leave," she said. "That," he said, "is a conversation to have with Mr. Kang. You just told me my background check cleared." "I did, which means I'm not a security concern." "Which means," he said precisely, "that you are not who sent the men to the hospital." He looked at her without moving. "It does not mean you are not a complication." "A complication," she said. "You are now aware of this location, of certain aspects of this organization's operations. That knowledge creates obligations. On both sides." She held his gaze. "Are you telling me that knowing where I am is now a problem for me?" "I'm telling you," he said with a smile that reached his eyes without involving them, "that the conversation with Mr. Kang is the one that matters. I am simply providing context." He rose, smoothed his jacket, and left the way he'd come. She sat with the cherry tree and thought about the word complication, and the way he'd said obligations, and the particular quality of a smile that a man deployed when what he was actually doing was setting the frame for something else. She found Tae-hyun in the library that evening. She didn't knock. The door was open and he was at the window, not at the desk, standing with his weight shifted slightly away from his injured shoulder, looking out at the darkening courtyard. He heard her come in and didn't turn immediately, which told her he'd already known she was there, which meant he'd heard her in the corridor, which said something about the quality of his attention, even when he appeared to be doing nothing. "Seokjin spoke to me today," she said. He turned then. "I know." He implied that what I know about this place is now a liability. Tae-hyun's face was neutral. What he implied, and what is true, are sometimes different things. "Are they different in this case?" "A beat." "Sit down, Dr. Bennett." "I'd rather stand." He looked at her for a moment, then, "Your background check cleared. You're free to leave this compound." "And then what?" "We will arrange for your return to—" "And then what?" she said again more precisely. "I go back to the hospital? The hospital where someone sent professional killers? I go back to my apartment, which presumably whoever arranged this knows the address of since they clearly had full intelligence on your movements? I go back to my life and soul as if none of this happened, and the people who arranged the attempt last week just decide I'm not a thread worth pulling?" He was quiet. "You said you don't lie," she said. "Don't tell me I'm safe the moment I leave here if you don't believe that." The library was still around them. Outside, the courtyard lights had come on. throwing long shadows from the cherry trees across the pale stones. "No," he said finally. "I don't believe that." "Then we have a problem," she said. "Yes. So what do we do about it? What do we do about—" He moved away from the window to the desk, which she'd noticed was his thinking position. Behind the desk, hands on the surface, using its solidity for something. He didn't sit. He stood and looked at her from across the room. "There is a position here," he said, "within the compound, a medical role. Dr. Lim is not full-time. The staff here, and the people within my organization who occasionally require discreet medical attention, it has been a gap." He stopped. "I am not offering you a captivity with a title. I am offering you a role that is genuine, with compensation and terms, while the external situation is resolved." She looked at him for a long time. "How long?" she said. "I don't know. That's the second time you've said that." "I am aware. You run an organization that clearly has substantial resources and intelligence infrastructure. How is it that you don't know how long it will take to identify one internal—" She stopped, looked at him. "You already know it's internal, don't you? You knew before I said it in the kitchen." His hands on the desk were still. Everything about him was still in that particular way. "The hospital knew your schedule," she said. "Your room number, your security team's positions, the maintenance access codes." She watched his face. "That's not outside intelligence. That's somebody's inside knowledge." "Yes." "And you don't know who?" "I have. Suspicions." "But you can't move on suspicion." "No," he said. "I cannot." She looked at him for a moment. This man who ran what she was increasingly understanding was not a multinational investment group in any meaningful sense, who had been shot in a hospital and had survived it and come home to a compound where someone in his own organization might have put the bullet in him, who was standing at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and his injured shoulder slightly elevated, and his face giving nothing away to anyone who wasn't paying the particular kind of attention she was paying. "All right," she said. "All right, what?" "I'll stay. For now." She held up a hand when he started to speak. "Not because you've given me a job, because leaving right now is genuinely more dangerous than staying, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make myself feel more in control of the situation. I'm staying because it's the rational choice." She paused. "We clear on that?" "Perfectly," he said, and something moved in his eyes that she didn't have a word for yet. The weeks that followed had a rhythm she hadn't expected. She set up a proper medical protocol for the compound, inventoried everything, established a log, arranged for supply delivery through channels that Dong-hyun coordinated with zero apparent curiosity about the identity of the foreign nurse who'd apparently become a permanent fixture. She treated what came to her, a broken finger that had been bound incorrectly for a week, before someone finally admitted it hurt, a respiratory infection moving through 3 of the security staff, a man named Rio who came to her with a knife wound. He'd explained with 4 words, "Training," he said, "gets real sometimes," and who she stitched in silence while he stared at the ceiling and neither of them commented on the obvious. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work. And she was learning the compound the way she had always learned places, not through what people said about them, but through how they moved through them. She learned that Seok-jin arrived twice a week, always on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always with a briefcase that he carried himself rather than having carried, and that the security staff shifted slightly in their bearing when he was present, subtly, but she caught it. A fraction more formality, a fraction more attention to angles and exits. She learned that Tae-hyun ran the compound with a completeness of authority that never required volume. She never heard him raise his voice. She never heard him threaten anyone. What she heard, occasionally, from adjacent rooms or across the courtyard, was the quality of silence that gathered around him when he spoke, the way everyone in a room would stop their peripheral movement and attend to him with their whole bodies. And that silence was more absolute than any volume she'd encountered. She learned that he was awake before 5 every morning, and that he took his coffee the same way every time. Black, no temperature preference, just black, and that he read in the evenings and moved through the compound in the early hours before the staff arrived for the day shift with the specific ease of a man who used the empty hours to be, briefly, unobserved. She stopped pretending she wasn't paying attention to all of it. On a Thursday in the 3rd week, she was in the treatment room when she heard the argument. It was coming from the east corridor, 2 voices, and she recognized one of them immediately, Seok-jin. and the quality of his voice was different from the careful pleasantness he'd shown her, lower and with an edge she hadn't heard in him before. The other voice was younger, one of the operational managers whose name she'd learned was Park Chul-soo, a compact man in his 40s who'd always moved around her with a wariness that she'd read as professional suspicion. She could hear the argument clearly through the treatment room wall, but it was in Korean, and her Korean was conversational rather than fluent, and what she caught was partial, enough to know it was heated, enough to pull certain words from the stream. She caught the word for liability twice. She caught a phrase she thought meant too much access. She caught clearly her own name rendered in Korean phonetics, Bennett. She kept still and listened and caught, near the end, a phrase that she translated slowly in her head. He won't see it until it's already done. Then footsteps, and the argument ending the way arguments in this compound ended, not with conclusion, but with someone walking away. She thought about that phrase all through the afternoon. He won't see it until it's already done. That evening, she sat across from Tae-hyun in the library and they worked through the physical therapy she'd designed for his shoulder. Not beside each other, because that would have been too much of something neither of them was naming yet, but with a professional distance that they both maintained with the specific care of people who were aware it required maintenance. "Tell me about the shoulder," she said. "The original surgery." He was moving through the third rotation exercise, controlled and slightly too slow, which meant it hurt more than he was showing. "Why?" "Because understanding the original damage helps me understand the compensation patterns, which helps me design this." She nodded at the exercise. "Stop favoring it." "I'm not favoring it." "You absolutely are. Push through the last 10 degrees. His jaw set. He pushed. She watched the muscles in his shoulder move through the ROM and noted where the restriction was and said nothing. "Tokyo," he said after a moment. 8 years ago. I was involved in a situation that required I not use a hospital in Korea at that time. The surgery was done outside a hospital. In a facility, a sufficient one. He paused. The physician was capable but working with limited imaging. Limited imaging on a shoulder surgery is like doing electrical work in the dark, she said. You can get it roughly right. You usually don't get it exactly right. He looked at her. Is it fixable? The rotation loss, probably 60 to 70% of it, with sustained work. The rest you've probably incorporated permanently into your movement patterns at this point. It would take longer to unlearn the compensation than to rebuild around it. He was quiet for a moment, still holding the position she'd asked for. You talk about bodies like they're structures, he said. They are. Most medical people talk about them differently. Most medical people spent their training in controlled environments, she said. I grew up in a neighborhood where you learned pretty fast that a body is the most reliable piece of infrastructure a person has. And if you want to keep it functional, you treat it like it matters, not like it's fragile. He turned and looked at her directly with that full attention that she'd stopped flinching at mostly. Atlanta, he said. Atlanta. That's in Georgia, yes. I know what it is. I wasn't being condescending. You weren't, no, she said. Sorry. It's a reflex. He lowered his arm slowly. People have been condescending. In 14 months in Seoul, I have been the only black woman in almost every room I've walked into. So, yes, people have been condescending. She said it flatly, without heat. It was just a fact, the same as the rotation loss was a fact. It gets old. He nodded once with a directness she appreciated. No overperformance of sympathy, no deflection, just acknowledgement. Here, he said. That won't be a factor. She looked at him. You say that. I mean it. How do you mean it? I mean that anyone in this compound who behaves otherwise answers to me for it. He said it without inflection, which made it more credible than if he'd said it with emphasis. It was just a statement of structural fact. That has always been my policy. She held his gaze for a moment. Good to know, she said. They sat in the library for a while after the exercises were done, the way they'd been doing, not formally, not as a scheduled thing, but as something that had developed between them the way patterns between people develop, through repetition and the absence of active resistance. He read. She had a book of her own, though she wasn't really reading it. Outside the window, the cherry trees stood in the courtyard, and she'd noticed over the past few days that the ends of the branches were beginning to show something. Not blossoms yet, not even close, just the first faint swelling of buds, the beginning of the decision. Seokjin argued with Park Chul-soo today, she said. Tae-hyun looked up from his book. In the east corridor. I heard it through the treatment room wall. She kept her voice level. My Korean isn't good enough to catch everything, but I caught my name, and something that translated as, approximately, he won't see it until it's already done. The quality of stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. It was colder. You're certain of that phrase, he said. I'm fairly certain of the literal translation. I'll admit I could have miscaught a nuance. He looked at her for a moment. When? Around 3 in the afternoon. She paused. I don't know who they were arguing about. The he could have been anyone. Yes, he said, but the way he said it told her he had his own interpretation, and it was not ambiguous. She went back to her book, and he went back to his, and they sat in the library until the compound had fully settled into night around them, and when she said good night and rose to leave, he said her name, Dr. Bennett, and she paused at the door. Thank you, he said. For what? For telling me. She nodded once and went out into the corridor and walked back to her room, and she lay in the dark and thought about the phrase again. He won't see it until it's already done. And she thought about the pattern of Seok-jin's visits, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the briefcase he always carried himself, and the way the security staff's bearing shifted when he was present. And she thought about intelligence reports and access and the geometry of a long-held trust. And she felt something assembling in the back of her mind, still incomplete, still missing pieces, but taking shape the way a diagnosis took shape, first from scattered symptoms, then with increasing clarity, then with the terrible precision of a conclusion she couldn't unarrive at. By the 5th week, the compound had accepted her the way a body accepted a transplant, not enthusiastically, not without some residual resistance, but functionally. Mrs. O left the good tea visible on the counter when Zuri came into the kitchen in the mornings. Rio nodded at her in the courtyard with the nod of someone who had decided she was provisionally not a problem. Donghyun had stopped hovering in doorways when she moved between permitted areas of the compound, which she interpreted as either trust or the recognition that she wasn't going anywhere. She and Tae-hyun had breakfast together 3 mornings that week, which was not a thing either of them had decided to do. It was simply a thing that happened because they were both early risers, and the kitchen was the kitchen. They talked sometimes about things that were not the compound or the situation. She told him about trauma nursing, about the specific physics of keeping someone alive in a hallway with inadequate equipment and no support, and he listened with the full attention he gave everything, and occasionally asked questions that were precise in a way that told her he had a mind that wanted to understand the mechanics of things. He told her once, briefly, about the investment businesses, thus the legitimate side, which was real, not a facade, businesses that employed several hundred people, and which he spoke about with a specificity and care that surprised her, or would have surprised her before she'd spent weeks understanding that he contained more than his surface. On Thursday of the 5th week, Seok-jin came for his regular visit. She watched him cross the courtyard from the treatment room window. Briefcase. Same suit, different color. The same ease of movement that she'd started cataloging differently since the argument. The ease of a man who believed he was safe, who believed his position was unassailable, whose confidence was not the confidence of a man with nothing to hide, but the confidence of a man who believed his hiding was complete. She watched him disappear into the main building. That evening, something happened that changed the temperature of the compound in a way she felt before she understood. She heard it first. Raised voices from the direction of Tae-hyun's office, which was in a part of the main building she didn't have access to, but the building conducted sound the way buildings did when you knew them. She heard the sharp, flat crack of a hand hitting a desk surface. She heard Tae-hyun's voice, not loud, but with a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something underneath the control, pressing against it. Then quiet. Then Seok-jin's footsteps in the corridor below her room, moving toward the main entrance, not his usual pace. Then the sound of the main gate. Dong-hyun appeared at her door 20 minutes later. He looked like a man holding something in. "Mr. Kong would like to see you," he said. Tae-hyun was at the window when she entered the office. His back was to the door. The desk had a glass of water on it and nothing else. Everything else had been cleared, which was unlike the usual state of the desk, and she understood that the clearing had happened during whatever had just occurred. "Close the door," he said. She did. He turned. His face was composed, the same flat control, but his eyes were doing something different. Not cold, something that was the opposite of cold, contained with visible effort. What happened? She said. I confronted Seokjin with a question about the hospital. She waited. His answer was wrong, Taehyun said. Not in its content, in its structure. He knew the answer before I finished the question. He knew precisely which question I was asking. She looked at him. You didn't give him the full question. I gave him the first half. And he finished it. Yes. The room was very quiet. I've known him for 23 years, Taehyun said. He said it the way someone said a fact they were currently in the process of dismantling. He has been in this organization since before I led it. He managed the transition when my father... He stopped. Something moved across his face and then was gone. She didn't push on it. She waited. I cannot act on a half-finished question, he said. I need something that holds. Something that closes every possible alternative interpretation. His eyes found hers across the room. You said the intelligence started from the inside. Yes. What would you look for? If you were looking. She thought about it for a moment. Pattern breaks, she said. Whoever's doing this has been doing it for a while. The hospital wasn't their first move. You don't arrange something like that as a first move, which means there are previous incidents, previous near misses, or close calls that at the time looked like bad luck or external intelligence. You look at those events and you ask, who knew what in advance? And then you see whose knowledge intersects with every one of them. She paused. You build a map. He looked at her for a long time. I have intelligence reports going back 4 years, he said. Incidents that were assessed and closed. I want to look at them again. I can help with the pattern analysis, she said, if you'll let me. He held her gaze. She saw the decision cross his face. Not whether to trust her. The decision had already been made somewhere in the previous weeks, in the kitchens and the library and the courtyard, but whether to let her fully into the architecture of what this was. All right, he said. They worked until 2 in the morning, she and Taehyun and a third man named Ji-ho, who was Taehyun's head of internal security, and who looked at Zuri with a flat professional assessment, and then, apparently deciding she was authorized, spoke to her directly, and without the careful distance the rest of the staff maintained. The reports were in Korean, which meant Ji-ho and Taehyun translated the relevant sections while she listened and organized and asked specific questions. Not about the content of each incident, but about the logistics, the timing, the informational prerequisites. What did you need to know to make this happen? When would you have needed to know it? Who knew it at that time? By midnight, she had a chart in her head. Not on paper. She'd been working entirely in her mind, building the structure as the information came in. And by 1 in the morning, the structure had a shape that was becoming hard to ignore. By 2, it had a name. She looked at Taehyun across the table. Every incident, she said carefully. Every one of them. The informational window. The period during which whoever did this would have had access to the specific information required is the same. 48 to 72 hours. Not wider. And in that window, for every incident, there is one constant. Ji-ho had gone still across the table. Taehyun's face was a wall. I know, she said quietly. Say it, he said. His voice was completely even. The access pattern maps to Seokjin's visit schedule, she said. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Every incident occurred within 72 hours of a Thursday visit going back. She glanced at the dates. 31 months. The room was absolutely silent. And then Ji-ho said, in Korean, something that Taehyun didn't translate for her, but she didn't need him to. Because the look on Ji-ho's face when he said it was the look of a man who had just watched the floor fall out from under everything he'd believed was solid, and Taehyun's face in response was the look of a man standing in that same wreckage and refusing, on principle, to fall. We build the trap, Taehyun said finally, his voice quiet and completely resolved. We do it properly. We do it in a way that closes every door. Ji-ho nodded, Zuri nodded, and none of them said what they were all thinking, which was that the man they were planning to trap had 23 years of knowledge about exactly how Kang Taehyun operated, which meant he would see a trap coming with the same clarity that Taehyun saw everything, and that this would not be a clean or simple thing, and that the first person he would move against when he sensed the walls closing in would not be Taehyun at all. It would be the one person Taehyun had let inside the walls who hadn't been there before. Outside, the cherry trees in the courtyard had put out their first real buds. pale and fragile in the dark. And Zuri looked at them through the window and thought, we're already out of time, we just don't know it yet. And the trap we're building is also the trap we're already standing in. And somewhere on the other side of these walls, Seokjin is already moving. She didn't sleep. She lay on top of the bed covers with her shoes still on and stared at the ceiling and let her mind run the pattern over and over, the way she ran differential diagnoses. Not to arrive somewhere new, but to test the structure of what she'd already found, to look for the place where it could fall apart. It didn't fall apart. The map held every time she ran it, the intersection of dates and access windows in Seokjin's Thursday briefcases, 31 months of it, a geometry that only produced one shape no matter which angle she approached it from. The cherry tree buds outside her window were pale smudges in the dark. She thought about what Seokjin had said to her in the courtyard 3 weeks ago. Complication, obligations. The conversation she'd understood as a frame at the time, but whose full dimension she was only now seeing. He hadn't been warning her about the organization's relationship to her knowledge. He'd been assessing how much she'd seen, how much she'd understood, whether she was, yet, a problem that required a specific kind of solution. She thought, he knows we know, not the details. But he felt the shift in the room tonight when Tae-hyun asked his half-question and Seokjin answered the wrong way. 23 years of reading Kang Tae-hyun's temperature. He felt it. At 4:15, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door. Not the security rotation, wrong timing. Measured steps, unhurried, moving past her door without pausing. She lay still and listened to them continue toward the east stairwell and fade. She thought about the trap they'd agreed to build. The careful, closed, every-door-shut trap. It required time. Jiho had said a week minimum to construct the informational architecture, to create a piece of intelligence specific enough that only Seokjin's network would receive it, distinctive enough to trace back to him when it was acted on. A week. She'd looked at Tae-hyun when Jiho said it, and she'd read in his face the same thing she was thinking now at 4:15 in the dark. We don't have a week. She was right. They had less than 18 hours. She didn't know that yet. She found out the way you find out things in places like this. Not with a warning, not with preparation time, but with the flat and total fact of it, arriving all at once. Morning came gray and still. She was in the kitchen by 5:30, coffee made, standing at the window. The courtyard was empty. The cherry trees had their buds. She watched them and drank her coffee and thought about Park Jae-won, who had 2 sons, and about the woman with bursitis who'd thanked her last week with a formality that had somehow been more moving than warmth, and about Rio who said training gets real sometimes, and about all the people in this compound who were living inside a loyalty that was about to find out how much it actually cost. Tae-hyun came down at 5:55. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't a version of good morning that fit the weight of what they'd built together in the small hours. He poured his coffee. He stood beside her at the window. Jiho is already working, he said. Good. He'll have a framework by tonight. She nodded. She didn't say what she was thinking. She was looking at the courtyard, at the gate, at the particular quality of the morning light on the stones. Tae-hyun, she said. She hadn't used his name before without the honorific, and she heard herself do it and didn't correct it, and he didn't react to it, or rather he reacted to it in the specific way of someone who registers a thing and chooses to let it stand. He's not going to wait for us to finish the trap, she said. He was quiet for a moment. No. He's been doing this for 31 months. Probably longer. We only have 4 years of reports. A man who's operated at that level for that long, inside this organization, he has contingencies. He has something already in place. Yes. So the question is what he does with it. Tae-hyun set his coffee cup down on the counter. She watched his hands, steady, deliberate. He will move against what matters to me, he said. That is how he operates. Always has. He doesn't attack the structure directly. He attacks the thing the structure is protecting. She understood what he meant, and she understood without him saying it that what the structure was currently protecting included her, and she felt that understanding settle into her body with a cold clarity that was different from fear but lived in the same neighborhood. What do you need me to do? She said. Stay visible, he said. Normal pattern. Kitchen, treatment room, courtyard. Don't give him a change in behavior to read. And you? I'm going to give him something to read instead. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means I'm going to give him a reason to believe the trap hasn't been set yet, that I am still uncertain, that last night's conversation didn't land where it landed. He turned from the window. I've been managing his perception of me for 23 years. I know exactly what uncertainty looks like to him. She searched his face. The control there was immense. The product of decades, she understood now, built on something she didn't have the full shape of yet, some foundational thing in his past that had made the control necessary before it became natural. Be careful, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, briefly, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Then he picked up his coffee and left the kitchen, and she stood alone at the window and watched the courtyard and counted her own heartbeats until they steadied. The morning passed in its normal pattern. She did rounds in the treatment room. She checked in on the man whose hand she'd stitched, whose wound was healing cleanly. She restocked 2 supply shelves. She went to the courtyard and sat by the cherry tree in the thin, cold sun and read her book, or appeared to. Seok Jin arrived at 10:17, not Thursday, not his schedule. She clocked it from the courtyard and kept her eyes on her page and felt the specific quality of wrongness that comes when a pattern breaks without explanation. He crossed the courtyard. He saw her. He stopped. Dr. Bennett, he said. His voice was its usual careful pleasantness. Director Min, she said. Enjoying the morning? The buds are coming in, she said, nodding at the cherry tree. Won't be long now. He looked at the tree. Something in his face was doing a calculation she couldn't fully read, which was unusual because she could usually read people. Indeed, he said, and went inside. She kept her eyes on the page and did not move for 4 full minutes, and then she went back to the treatment room and stood with her back against the closed door and breathed. Not Thursday. He'd broken his own pattern, which meant something had changed in his calculus since last night, which meant Tae-hyun's performance of uncertainty hadn't worked fully, or there was something else moving that none of them had accounted for. She pulled out the small notebook she'd been using to log patient notes, the only paper she had access to, and looked at the last clean page, and she thought about what she knew and what she didn't, and what the shape of the next move was. She was still standing there when Dong-hyun opened the treatment room door. His face was wrong. She'd spent 6 weeks learning his face, its professional neutrality, and this was different. He looked like a man whose professional neutrality was the only thing he had left, and he was holding it with both hands. Mr. Kang would like to see you, he said. Now, she followed him. Not to the library, not to the office, to the east corridor, a room she hadn't been in, a smaller space that served as a secondary meeting room. Ji-ho was there. Tae-hyun was there. There was a third man she didn't recognize, older, who had the bearing of someone who brought information for a living and knew that what he carried today was going to cause damage. Tae-hyun looked at her when she came in. His face was the wall. His eyes were not. Close the door, Ji-ho said. She closed it. 20 minutes ago, Tae-hyun said, we intercepted a communication going out of this compound, encrypted, routed through 3 external servers. He paused. Ji-ho's team broke it. She looked at Ji-ho. It was a location ping, Ji-ho said. His English was precise and flat. A single data point. Current compound position, confirmed active. Sent to a number we have associated with an external contractor network, the kind of network used for the hospital. The room was very quiet. It went out at 9:53 this morning, Ji-ho continued, before Director Min arrived. She processed that. So it wasn't Seok Jin who sent it. No. Someone else in the compound. Yes. Which means, she said slowly, he has more than one person inside. The silence in the room had a different quality now. She looked at Tae-hyun and saw in his face something she hadn't seen in 6 weeks. Not fear, not anger, but the specific devastation of a man who has built his entire life on understanding the limits of who he can trust and has just discovered that the limit he thought he'd mapped doesn't exist. Who sent it? She said. Ji-ho looked at Tae-hyun. Tae-hyun said, Park Chul-soo, the operational manager. The man who'd argued with Seok Jin in the corridor 3 weeks ago. The argument she'd overheard. The argument where she'd heard her own name and the phrase he won't see it until it's already done. Not an argument. A coordination. Staged in the corridor outside the treatment room at a time when she was known to be inside it. Staged for her to overhear. The phrase she'd brought to Tae-hyun, the warning she'd thought she was giving him, it had been put in her path deliberately. She understood this in pieces, each one dropping into place with the mechanical precision of a very bad diagnosis. They had wanted Tae-hyun to know she'd overheard. They had wanted her to bring it to him. They had wanted to accelerate his suspicion of Seok-jin to the point where he'd move before he was ready, before the trap was ready, before he had anything that held. And now Seok-jin was in the main building, and a location ping had gone out 40 minutes ago, and she was standing in this room, understanding that she had been a tool in this from the beginning. "He used me," she said. Nobody disagreed. She looked at Tae-hyun. "He used me to push you toward a confrontation last night, before Jiho had the framework ready. He wanted you off balance and moving too fast." "Yes," Tae-hyun said. "And the ping this morning means they're not waiting for your next move." She kept her voice level with an effort she felt physically in her sternum. "They're moving now." The third man, the information carrier, spoke then in Korean, and Jiho translated without being asked, which told her how serious it was. "Our external team has confirmed a vehicle convoy. 3 vehicles, in Cheon direction. They left a staging location 40 minutes ago. Estimated arrival at current compound position, 40 to 50 minutes. She looked at the clock on the wall, which meant 15 to 25 minutes from now. Tae-hyun turned and looked at her with complete directness. "I need you to go to the safe room on the 2nd floor. Jiho will—" "No," she said. "Dr. Bennett, I'm not going to a room to wait while this happens," she said. "Tell me what you need medically. I can set up triage in the treatment room. This is not a medical situation yet." "It will be." She held his gaze. "Let me do what I do." Something crossed his face. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she understood that the look was not about tactics or logistics. It was the look of a man who was, against every instinct and architecture of self-protection, afraid of something happening to a specific person, and who was discovering that this was now true of him, and that the discovery was happening at the worst possible time. "The treatment room," he said. "You stay in the treatment room." "Yes, Dong-hyun stays with you." "Fine." He held her gaze one moment more, then he turned to Jiho and they began speaking in rapid Korean, and the room shifted into the specific kind of organized urgency that she recognized from trauma bays, everyone knowing their function, everyone moving toward it. She went to the treatment room. She moved fast. She pulled every piece of equipment she might need and laid it out with the efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions with worse supplies, who had worked a mass casualty event in a hospital hallway with 2 other nurses and no attending physician and kept 4 people alive until the surgeon arrived, who knew from deep and specific experience that preparation in the first 5 minutes determined everything that came after. Dong-hyun stood in the doorway and watched her with an expression that was trying to be professional and was not entirely succeeding. "How many people are in the compound right now?" she said, not stopping her prep. 31, including staff, he said. 17 security. "Are there people here who aren't combat trained? Administrative, household?" "Mrs. O, 2 kitchen staff, 3 administrative. Get them to the north building basement. Do it now, before anything starts. Do it quietly." Dong-hyun hesitated. "Do it," she said. "It doesn't compromise anything, and it means I don't have to treat people I can't help if something goes wrong." He left. She kept working. At 11:42 the first sounds came. Not from the gate, from the east perimeter wall, which told her the convoy had split, which told her these were people who knew the compound's layout, who had been inside it or had detailed intelligence on it, which she supposed she already knew. Then the gate, too. She heard it the way she heard everything in crises. Sound as information, each thing telling her something. Controlled bursts, disciplined. This wasn't a panic assault, it was a structured entry. She heard return fire from the compound's security team, heard the pattern of it, heard the specific difference between defensive positioning and being pushed back. She heard someone shouting in Korean in the east corridor, and she identified the voice as Rio's, and she translated enough to understand that the east perimeter breach was being contained. Dong-hyun came back to the doorway breathing hard. "East wall held," he said. "Gate breach. They're in the courtyard." "How many?" 6 confirmed, maybe more." "Are people?" 2 down at the gate. "Wounded. I don't know how bad." "Get them here as soon as it's clear enough to move them," she said. He nodded and was gone again. She stood in the treatment room and heard the compound fight around her. Not chaos, but the specific brutal physics of trained people in a contained space, and under it, threading through it like a current she could feel in her chest. The awareness of where Tae-hyun was, what he was doing, whether the wall was still standing. She was afraid. She acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged all the things she couldn't afford to let stop her, and she kept her hands moving and her mind on what was in front of her. The first wounded man arrived 11 minutes later. Rio, of all people. Rio, who said training gets real sometimes, brought in with his arm pressed to his side and blood coming through his jacket in a way that told her immediately intercostal laceration, significant blood loss, possible pneumothorax. She cut his jacket off while he was still upright and said, "Sit now." And he sat, and she worked. He was the first of 3 in the next 20 minutes. She didn't stop. She did not have the capacity to stop. She was in the place she'd trained herself to occupy, the place where the noise fell away and there was only the body in front of her and what it needed. And she moved through the work with the specific focus that was the best thing she'd ever been able to offer anyone. It was when the compound went quiet that she understood something had changed. Not the quiet of resolution, the wrong kind of quiet, the held breath kind, the kind she'd recognized in the hospital corridor 6 weeks ago when she'd first understood that the shot she'd heard was a real one. She finished the compression wrap on the third patient and straightened and looked at Dong-hyun. His face told her. "Where is he?" she said. Dong-hyun didn't answer immediately. "Dong-hyun, where is Tae-hyun?" "The courtyard," he said. He stopped. There was a secondary team, small. They came from the north side during the gate engagement. He stopped again. She was already moving. "Dr. Bennett, you can't..." She was already in the corridor. The courtyard was the aftermath of controlled violence. 2 men down, secured, not dead. The compound security team moving through it in the specific pattern of a sweep. The cherry trees had taken some damage, a lower branch broken, blossoms scattered on the wet stones. The buds had opened in the last hour. She registered that with the part of her brain that noticed things even when it shouldn't. Jiho was standing near the far gate. He turned when he heard her. She looked at his face and felt the floor shift under her. "Where?" she said. "They took him," Jiho said. The words were flat and careful and cost him something. 3 men from the north. They had a vehicle inside the perimeter, pre-positioned. Seok-jin was with them. He paused. "They took him through the north service gate. We have the direction. We're tracking." She stood in the courtyard with the broken cherry blossoms around her feet and the cold air in her lungs and her hands that still had blood on them from the work she'd just been doing. And she looked at Jiho and said, "How long ago?" 14 minutes. 14 minutes. She ran it. 3 vehicles, organized extraction. 14 minutes. Inch on direction they'd had from the morning ping. They weren't improvising. This was the contingency. The trap they'd feared Seok-jin was setting had not been an attack on the compound at all. The attack had been the distraction. The compound assault was noise. The real operation was the extraction of Kang Tae-hyun while his security resources were committed to defending his own walls. "He planned it this way from the beginning," she said. "Not a question." "Yes," Jiho said. She looked at the broken branch on the cherry tree. She thought about the argument in the corridor that had been staged for her to overhear. She thought about the careful, patient months of it, the way Seok-jin had mapped Tae-hyun's emotional landscape, identified what had changed in the compound since she'd arrived, understood that Tae-hyun's judgment had been altered by something new, something that could be used. She thought about a man with 23 years of knowledge about exactly how Kang Tae-hyun operated, deciding that the best way to destroy him was not through his organization, but through what he had finally, after 20 years of refusing to, allowed to matter. "He's going to kill him," she said. "Not immediately," Jiho said, with the precision of someone who knew what he was talking about. "He needs time with him first. There are assets, account structures, key signatories. He needs information that only Tae-hyun controls." He paused. "But yes, eventually." She looked at Jiho. "Then we don't have eventually." "No." "What do you have on the location?" "The ping from this morning that..." The staging location coordinates were partially recoverable. Incheon, near the harbor, industrial district. We have a 6-block radius. "That's not a location," she said. "That's an area. It's what we have." She stood in the courtyard and looked at the sky over the compound walls. The gray soul sky, the thin cold light. And she felt the specific weight of a moment in which the situation had become something that was going to require her to be different from what she'd been. something that was going to require her to go toward the danger the way she always had. But further this time, further than a hospital corridor, further than she'd gone before, and she felt the fear of it clearly, and held it at arm's length with both hands, and said to Jiho, "Get me everything you have on Seok-jin. Every property, every contact, every name connected to his network going back as far as you have it." She looked at him directly. "And get me a vehicle, because I know something about him that you don't, and it's the kind of thing that might tell us which block in that 6 block radius was chosen." Jiho looked at her. "What do you know?" "His shoulder," she said. "Seok-jin's. Left side. He carries that briefcase in his right hand every time he comes to this compound because his left shoulder has a limitation he doesn't want visible. I noticed it the first morning he came to my room." She held Jiho's gaze. A man who's operated in the shadows for 31 months doesn't use a random staging location. He uses somewhere he has a reason to know. A personal connection, a medical connection, something he's visited before without it looking unusual. She paused. "Pull his medical records if you have them. Any facility within that 6 block radius that has an orthopedic department or a private treatment clinic. That's your block." Jiho stared at her for 2 seconds. Then he turned and spoke rapidly into his earpiece. She went back to the treatment room and washed the blood off her hands and looked at herself in the small mirror above the sink. Her face looked the way it felt. Not panicked, not composed. Just present, just running, the way she'd always looked in the moments that actually counted. She thought about Tae-hyun in a vehicle 14 minutes ahead of her. She thought about Seok-jin's face in the courtyard that morning, looking at the cherry tree, running his calculation. She dried her hands and went back out to find Jiho, because they were already behind and standing still was not something she could afford to do. The drive to Incheon took 38 minutes, which was too long and couldn't be helped. Jiho's team had pulled Seok-jin's financial records and found it inside 20 minutes. A private rehabilitation facility in the Incheon Industrial Waterfront District, registered under a shell company that was 3 layers removed from Seok-jin's name but collapsed to him once you knew to look. The facility had been operational for 2 years. It appeared in no public directory. It had a receiving entrance on the harbor side and vehicle access from the rear through what mapped as a decommissioned warehouse loading corridor. Zuri sat in the second SUV with Jiho and 2 of his team and a medical bag she'd packed in 4 minutes flat, and she held the bag in her lap and watched the Incheon highway unspool through the windshield and kept her breathing deliberate and her mind on the mechanics of what came next. "When we get there," Jiho said, without looking at her, "you stay with the second team until the primary space is secured. If he's been in there for over an hour, I know. If there's been any physical—" "I know," Jiho said, and the flatness of it told her he'd thought through exactly the same things she was thinking and had arrived at the same cold acknowledgement of what an hour with Seok-jin might mean for a man Seok-jin had spent 23 years learning how to break. She held the medical bag tighter and said nothing else. The facility was a low gray building set back from the harbor, the kind of building that had been designed to look like nothing in particular and had succeeded. The harbor smell hit when they opened the vehicle doors, salt and diesel and cold industrial air, and Zuri stood in the parking structure of the adjacent warehouse while Jiho's primary team moved in patterns she couldn't fully follow, communicating in the compressed shorthand of people who'd trained together for years. She counted her heartbeats. It was the only clock she had. The primary team went in through the rear loading access. She heard nothing for 40 seconds. No shots, which was information of a particular kind. Either the building was clear of the external perimeter team, or the entry had been silent enough to prevent engagement. Then Jiho's earpiece produced a sound and his face did something controlled and he turned to her. 3 hostiles in the front section, he said. Neutralized. Building is 4 zones. They're in the back zone. He paused. Harbor facing. There's... He stopped. Tell me. There's a secondary detonation risk. They wired the rear section. Standard contingency. If the building is breached from the front, they can collapse the harborside rooms and make it look like a structural failure. He looked at her steadily. My team is working the wire. It takes time. She absorbed that. A collapse. Harbor-facing rooms, water access below. She thought about the physical geometry of it. A building on the waterfront wired to fail inward, toward the harbor, and everyone in the harbor-facing zone going with it into the water, or the wreckage, and the cold, dirty water of Incheon Harbor in early spring, and a man with a fresh bullet wound from 6 weeks ago whose shoulder mechanics were already compromised, and she felt something move through her chest that was not fear exactly, but was closer to fear than anything she'd felt since the hospital corridor. "How long?" she said. 15 minutes to clear the wire safely." "How long do we actually have?" Jiho's jaw set. "Seokjin knows we tracked him. The ping that went out this morning, he'll have had a counter protocol for how long he had before we could run it down. He will have calculated." He paused. "Probably less than 15 minutes. So we can't wait for the wire." "No." She looked at him. "Then what's the plan?" "The plan," Jiho said, "is that my team goes through the wire zone anyway and accepts the risk." He said it the way you said facts that were going to cost something. "And you stay here." She looked at the building. She looked at the harbor behind it, gray water, cold light. She looked at Jiho. "I'm going in with you," she said. "That is not... If that wire goes and the structure fails and people are in that room, you need someone who can keep them alive in a collapsed space. You need someone who can work in debris, in water, with nothing." She held his gaze. "Jiho, you know I'm right." He looked at her for a long moment. His face went through something she didn't try to name. "You stay behind me," he said. "You move when I move. You stop when I say stop. You do not argue with me about any instruction I give you inside that building. Understood?" "Understood," she said. They went in. The front section smelled like industrial cleaning fluid and something underneath it that she identified and put away. 3 men secured on the floor, zip-tied, conscious, which meant Jiho's team had been efficient and disciplined. She stepped over them without breaking stride, following Jiho through a connecting corridor that narrowed as it went, the building closing around them, the harbor smell getting stronger as they moved toward the back zone. The wire was visible in the connecting doorway. Crude, she noted, not sophisticated, designed for reliability rather than elegance, 2 lines running along the doorframe to a pressure trigger on the far side. One of Jiho's men was on his knees working it with the focused economy of someone who knew what he was doing and was also acutely aware of how much he'd like to still be alive in 5 minutes. Jiho spoke to him quietly in Korean. The man answered without looking up. 2 minutes, Jiho translated. "Maybe." She looked through the gap in the doorframe. The corridor beyond was dim. Single industrial lights mounted at intervals, the kind of lighting that made everything look like its own shadow. At the far end, a door, closed, light coming through the gap at the bottom. Sound coming through it, too. Voices. One voice, steady and low, and under it, something she identified with her whole body before her brain had finished the sentence. The specific quality of silence from a person who has decided not to give the other person the sound they're asking for. Her hands were steady. She noticed that and was grateful for it. The man on his knees said something short and sat back, and Jiho said, "Go!" And they went through the doorframe single file, fast, and moved down the corridor, and Jiho had his weapon up and his hand back toward her. "Stay." And she stayed, 3 feet behind him, and he took the door. The room was larger than the corridor suggested. Harbor-facing, a wall of industrial windows with the gray water visible beyond them. Weak afternoon light coming through salt-crusted glass. The room had been set up as something between an office and an interrogation space. A table, chairs, equipment she didn't look at directly, and at the far end, near the windows, 2 men standing and 1 man in a chair. The man in the chair was Tae-hyun. He was upright, which was the first thing she assessed, which meant he was conscious, which meant she made herself slow down and look properly rather than reaching for the conclusion she needed. He was upright and conscious, and his hands were secured behind the chair, and his head was raised, and his eyes, when they found her across the room, were completely clear. Not glassy, not shock pale, clear and focused and doing their own rapid assessment of the room the same way they always did. She breathed. Seokjin was standing 6 feet from the chair. He turned when Jiho came through the door, and his face in that moment was the most genuinely expressive she'd ever seen it. Not the locked pleasantness, not the careful warmth, but something stripped and angular. The face of a man whose calculation has just been falsified and who is running the new numbers in real time. The 2 men flanking him were already reacting, hands moving, and Jiho's team came through the door behind her in a controlled surge. And in the first 2 seconds of the room, it was the specific chaos of people with weapons assessing each other's angles, everyone's math running simultaneously. One of Seokjin's men fired. The shot went wide. Deliberate, she thought, a warning rather than an attempt, buying time, buying Seokjin's reaction a few seconds to complete itself. Jiho's team returned suppressing fire toward the window side, and she went flat against the wall and stayed there and watched Seokjin through the noise. He wasn't running. He was moving toward Taehyun. She understood before she fully processed it. He was moving toward Taehyun because Taehyun in that chair was the only leverage left in the room, and Seokjin was a man who had spent decades understanding leverage. She moved before she decided to move. She went across the room at an angle, not directly, using the table as intermediate cover, while Jiho's team had Seokjin's 2 men fully engaged at the window side. She got to the chair 2 seconds before Seokjin reached it, and she put herself between them, standing, facing Seokjin, with Taehyun's chair directly at her back. Seokjin stopped. He looked at her. The angular, stripped face, the running calculation. He had a weapon. She saw it in his right hand, down at his side, not raised, the position of a man who is keeping options open. "Move," he said. "No," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face settled. Not into calm, into decision. "You understand what you're doing," he said. "Yes. You understand that you are not significant. To this, you are an accident that became inconvenient. Nothing more." "I know what I am," she said. "Move back." He raised the weapon. Her heart was very loud. She could feel it in her throat, in her hands, in the specific clarity that came when the body understood exactly what it was facing and stripped everything down to the essentials. She stood and didn't move and held his gaze and did not look at the weapon because looking at the weapon was what he wanted. It was the thing that would make her flinch, and she had made a decision about flinching a long time ago. "Seokjin," Taehyun's voice from the chair behind her. Quiet. The same quality it always had. The absolute absence of performance. Seokjin's eyes moved to him. "Look at the room," Taehyun said. Seokjin looked. Jiho's team had both his men contained, one on the floor, one against the window wall with his hands up. The math of the room fully resolved in the last 30 seconds. Seokjin was the last number that hadn't settled. "You won't shoot her," Taehyun said. "Because if you shoot her, you have nothing left to negotiate with, and you know it. And I won't give you anything for my own life. You know that too. You've always known that." A pause. "That's why you changed tactics 15 years ago." Seokjin went very still. "Put it down," Taehyun said. Seokjin's face in this window light was terrible. Not the face of a man losing, but of a man watching something he'd built over decades finally collapse under its own weight, and finding, in the collapse, not the expected relief, but a rage that had nowhere left to go. "You never understood what I built for you," Seokjin said. His voice was different now. The pleasantness gone, the careful architecture gone, something raw and cold underneath. "Your father would have destroyed it, would have destroyed you. I kept you." "Don't," Taehyun said. "I kept this organization intact. I kept you alive and functional, and I made decisions that were necessary." "You killed him," Taehyun said. The room absorbed that sentence. The harbor light moved on the window glass. "My father," Taehyun said, and his voice was the flattest she'd ever heard it. Flat all the way down, nothing underneath it, the flatness of something that has been compressed for so long it has forgotten how to expand. 15 years. "You let me believe what I let you believe kept you moving forward," Seokjin said, and the rawness in his voice was not remorse. She heard that clearly. It was the rawness of a man defending the logic of his own actions to himself, using her and Taehyun and the room as audience. A man who knows his father was executed at 35 doesn't build an empire. He burns everything. "I gave you a version of events that let you function. You gave me a lie that let you control me," Taehyun said. Seokjin said nothing. "You isolated me," Taehyun said. "Every person who came close, every potential alliance, every—" He stopped. A beat. "Every reason I might have had to trust someone. You managed it, all of it. For 20 years you managed my isolation because a man alone is a man who depends on the one person who stays." The silence in the room was extraordinary. Zuri stood between them and felt the weight of what was moving through the space and kept her feet where they were, and her eyes on Seokjin's weapon hand, and breathed. 23 years, Seokjin said finally. "I gave you 23 years. "Lower the weapon," Jiho said from across the room. His voice was controlled and final. Seok-jin looked at the weapon in his own hand. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he'd forgotten he was holding. Then he looked at Zuri, directly, with the full attention he'd given her that first morning in her room, the careful, thorough examination of her, and she held it without looking away. And she saw in his face the precise moment when the calculation completed and came out the way she'd known it would. He lowered the weapon. Jiho's team moved immediately, efficiently, and Seok-jin was secured and the room's last variable resolved, and it was over in the way these things were over. Not with a sound, not with a moment, just with a sudden absence of tension that left everyone slightly unsure of what to do with their hands. She turned to Tae-hyun. Up close he was worse than he'd looked from across the room, which she'd expected. The assessment ran itself automatically. Left eye slightly swollen, a laceration above his right brow that was going to need closure, the way he was holding his torso telling her about his ribs, the set of his jaw telling her about pain he was managing with the same comprehensive stubbornness he brought to everything. His hands were still secured behind the chair, and she moved around and worked the restraint. And when it came free, he brought his arms forward slowly, and she watched his face carefully for the specific expression that would tell her there was nerve involvement. There wasn't. She let herself release that particular worry. He looked up at her. His face was the wall, but the wall had taken damage, not structural, but visible, the way a surface showed the force that had been applied to it even after the force was gone. "You came," he said. "Yes," she said. "I told you to stay in the treatment room." "I did for a while," she said. "Then I stopped." Something moved through his eyes that was not the ghost of a smile this time, but the actual thing, brief and exhausted and completely real, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest and didn't try to name it or manage it, just let it be there. She looked at the laceration above his brow. "That needs closure," she said. "And I want to assess your ribs before you try to stand, so don't—" "Dr. Bennett," he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment. He looked like a man who had just had the foundational architecture of 20 years dismantled in a single conversation and was still upright, which she found— she didn't have a word for what she found it. She found it something. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly medical. Then she opened the bag and got to work, because there was work to do and she was going to do it. And the harbor light was moving on the windows, and Seok-jin was secured on the far side of the room, and Jiho was already on his phone, and outside these walls the world was going to have questions that were going to take a long time to answer. But right now there was a wound above his right brow, and she had sutures in the bag, and she was going to close it, and he was going to sit still and let her. And that was enough for this particular moment. She cleaned the wound. Her hands were steady. His breathing was controlled, the way it always was, the long discipline of it, and she worked close enough to feel the warmth of him and the specific aliveness of him, and she thought about the mended cherry tree in the courtyard, and the buds that had opened this morning, and the blossoms on the stones, and she thought, we're not done yet. Seok-jin is secured, but his network isn't. His loyalists don't know yet that the center has collapsed, and when they find out, some of them will decide the answer is to finish what Seok-jin started. She placed the last suture and tied it off and clipped the thread, and pressed a clean gauze square against the closure and said, "Hold that." And Tae-hyun raised his hand and held it without being told a second time, and she moved to his ribs. "Breathe in," she said. He breathed. She pressed along the right lateral wall, watching his face, reading the micro-expressions that even his control couldn't fully suppress. 2 ribs, she assessed. Cracked rather than fully fractured. The breathing pattern was too controlled for a complete break, too painful for bruising alone. She pressed the 3rd intercostal space and felt him hold the breath and said, "There." "It's manageable," he said. "That's not the same as fine." "I know the difference." She looked at him for a moment, then began rapping. "You'll need imaging when we get back. If there's any pleural involvement, there isn't. You don't know that." "I know my body," he said. "The same way you know bodies. I've been reading mine for a long time." She kept rapping. The harbor light through the windows was shifting toward afternoon. They'd been in Incheon for over 2 hours, though it had compressed in the way that crisis time always did, everything simultaneous and sequential at once. Across the room, Jiho was coordinating the transfer of Seok-jin and the 2 secured men to vehicles, speaking in the low, rapid Korean of someone managing multiple threads. Seok-jin himself was sitting against the far wall, wrists bound, and he was looking at nothing. Not at Tae-hyun, not at her, not at the window. Just at the middle distance, with the expression of a man doing a private accounting of something. She thought about what Tae-hyun had said. 20 years of managed isolation, every person who came close. She thought about the surgical scar in Tokyo, the facility without proper imaging, the Dr. Tae-hyun had needed to reach because he couldn't use a hospital in Korea at that time. And she thought about what circumstance would make a man unable to use his own country's hospitals. And she thought about all the years of it, the compound, the loyalty, the authority that never needed volume, the coffee taken black with no temperature preference as if comfort were a category that didn't fully apply to him. She secured the wrap and straightened and looked at his face, and he was already looking at her. "Can you stand?" she said. "Yes." This time she believed him. They got back to the compound in the early evening, and the compound received them the way a place received people who had left under one set of conditions and returned under another, with a particular stillness that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but was something composed of both. Mrs. O was in the kitchen when Zuri came through. The older woman looked at her, at the state of her clothes, at the medical bag, at whatever was on her face, and turned to the stove and began reheating something without saying a word, which was its own language, and Zuri understood it fluently. She ate standing at the counter because she couldn't make herself sit yet. She hadn't eaten since 5:30 that morning, and her body was informing her of this with increasing emphasis. She ate and stared at the courtyard through the kitchen window and watched the compound's evening settle in. Tae-hyun had gone directly to imaging. She'd insisted on it before anything else, before debriefs and decisions, and the long administrative aftermath of what had happened today. And he had agreed with the specific compliance of a man who understood the negotiation was already over. Dr. Lim, summoned, had confirmed her assessment. 2 cracked ribs, no pleural involvement, no new complications to the shoulder. Manageable. The word Tae-hyun had used, which she was grudgingly conceding was accurate. Rio was in the treatment room, stable, the intercostal laceration closed and draining cleanly. 2 other men with lesser wounds had been treated and cleared. The compound's count, 3 wounded, none critical. It could have been much worse. She had held that thought at arm's length all afternoon, and she held it now in the kitchen with her reheated food and let herself feel, carefully and in controlled measure, the weight of the day. Park Jae-won had 2 sons. She thought about that again. She thought about the long chain of consequence that ran from a gunshot in a hospital corridor to an afternoon in an Incheon warehouse, and all the people caught in the links of it who hadn't chosen to be there. She washed her own dish when she was done, which felt important for reasons she didn't examine. Over the following week, the compound changed in ways that were subtle and structural simultaneously. Jiho's team worked through the network, Seok-jin's contacts, his external contractors, the financial architecture he had built over 3 decades of managing the organization's shadow infrastructure. Park Chul-soo was in custody and talking, which Jiho described with no particular satisfaction, which she appreciated. 3 other members of the organization's broader network were identified as Seok-jin's assets and quietly removed from operational roles. It was careful, surgical work, the kind of work that Tae-hyun oversaw with the completeness of authority that she'd spent weeks watching, except now she understood it differently. Not just the authority of a man accustomed to having it, but the authority of a man who had been isolated from the accountability that normally checked it, and who was now, for perhaps the first time in 20 years, choosing to apply it differently. She watched him choose, in the days that followed, not to do the easy thing. She watched him sit with the operational managers who remained and acknowledge that the organization had a rotten foundation in places that everyone in the room had lived with and chosen not to name. She watched him make the distinction, clearly and without sentiment, between the people who had been loyal to Seok-jin's version of things and the people who had been complicit in them, and hold only the latter to account. She watched him deal with the question of Seok-jin himself. That was the conversation she wasn't in the room for. She didn't ask about it afterward. What she knew was what Jiho told her, briefly, in the treatment room 3 days after Incheon. Seok-jin had been transferred to a facility under the organization's control, where he would remain indefinitely under conditions that were, Jiho said, choosing his words, appropriate to what he'd done. She'd looked at Jiho's face when he said it and understood that appropriate was another word that covered a geography she wasn't going to be given access to, and she had, again, filed it. She understood the world she was in. She didn't have to inhabit every room of it. On the 9th day after Incheon, Tae-hyun found her in the treatment room in the late afternoon. She She was doing inventory, the same task, she noted with a specific irony, that she'd been doing in the hospital corridor the night she'd heard the shot. He came in and looked at the shelves and then looked at her, and she looked back and waited. The external situation is resolved, he said. Seokjin's network is dismantled. The immediate risk to your safety is gone. He paused. You can leave. If you choose to. She put down the clipboard she was holding. And if I don't choose to, she said, then the offer I made you several weeks ago still stands. He held her gaze steadily. A genuine role. Real compensation. A position that matters. She studied him. He was standing slightly differently from the way he'd stood 6 weeks ago. The shoulder compensation was less pronounced, the result of 3 weeks of consistent therapy work, the body beginning to remember the possibility of different mechanics. It was a small thing. She noticed it. I want to expand the medical program, she said. Not just compound staff. There are immigrant families in the areas around this organization's legitimate businesses who have no access to consistent health care. I want a proper clinic, staffed, supplied, not a shadow operation, a real one with records and continuity of care. He looked at her for a moment. That's not a small undertaking. No, it creates visibility. A registered clinic connected to Kang Group infrastructure will be examined. Good, she said. Let it be examined. If the clinic is clean, visibility is protection, not exposure. She held his gaze. You told me you're trying to build something legitimate. This is legitimate. This is the most legitimate thing you could do. He was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this for a while, he said. Since about week 3, she said. Something moved through his face. All right, he said. All right, you'll consider it. Or, all right, he said again. And the way he said it the second time was different, was final, was a closed door on the deliberation and an open one on the thing itself. She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once. She stayed. The weeks after that had a different rhythm from the weeks before. Not easier, not simpler, but different in the specific way of things that had been stripped down to their actual nature. The compound's tension had changed quality. It was still present. This was still, at its core, what it was, and no amount of organizational restructuring was going to change that entirely. But it was the tension of a place that was in process, moving from one configuration toward another, rather than the held-breath tension of a place waiting for something hidden to detonate. The clinic planning moved forward. Dong Hyun, who turned out to have a genuinely organized mind beneath his professional neutrality, managed the logistics. Zuri worked with a Korean-American architect on the layout, and with Jiho on the security protocols that would allow the clinic to operate with appropriate protection without looking like what it was adjacent to. She also, during this period, had the conversation with Taehyun that she'd been aware was coming since the Incheon warehouse. It happened in the library, which was where most of the things that mattered had happened between them. Evening, the cherry trees outside in full bloom now. They had come in fully 2 weeks after Incheon. The courtyard transformed overnight, the kind of sudden extravagant change that felt like an argument against the idea that things only change slowly. She'd stood in the courtyard on the morning they bloomed and looked at them for a long time. He was at the desk. She sat across from him and said without preamble, because she had learned that preamble was not the language either of them used for things that mattered. Tell me about your father. He was still for a moment. Not what Seokjin told you, she said. What you actually knew. What you remember. He looked at her. Outside the window, the cherry blossoms moved in a light wind, pale and temporary, the kind of thing that was beautiful specifically because it didn't last. He was not a good man, Taehyun said. He said it flatly, without performance of either condemnation or grief. He was capable of. I watched him do things when I was young that I understood, even then, were beyond justification. He ran this organization with a brutality that I have spent 20 years moving away from. He paused. But he was my father, and Seokjin let me believe that he had been executed by a rival organization when I was 15, and I built... He stopped. I built a particular version of grief on that belief. And then 3 weeks ago in a warehouse in Incheon, I found out the foundation of it was false. She held the silence with him for a moment. How does it sit? She said. He thought about it with the honesty she'd come to understand was characteristic of him at his most unguarded. Complicated, he said. He was capable of terrible things, which Seokjin used as justification. Seokjin was also capable of terrible things, which invalidates the justification without redeeming my father. He looked at the window. Two people can be wrong simultaneously. I've spent a long time thinking in structures where someone had to be right. And now, she said, now I think the more useful question is what I do with it. He turned back to her. Not what it means. What I do. She looked at him for a long moment. That's the harder question, she said. Yes, he said. It is. The silence between them was comfortable in the specific way that silences between people who have been through something together and survived it became comfortable. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of enough trust to hold the unsaid without it becoming pressure. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Why did you stay? Initially, when the door was unlocked, he held her gaze. You gave me a rational answer at the time. The danger outside, the security calculus, that was all true, but it wasn't the whole answer. She looked at him. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd always thought about things she'd rather not examine. Because something here needed looking at, she said finally. Not the organization, not the security situation. She paused. You. The shoulder that someone did badly and you'd compensated around for 8 years without addressing. The way you moved through your own compound like it was a place you managed rather than a place you lived. She stopped. Started again. I've spent my whole career keeping people alive through the acute phase and sending them back out without anyone asking about the chronic damage. What's been there for a long time and just accepted as the condition of things. She looked at him steadily. I stayed because you were the chronic damage kind of case, and I wanted to actually finish the work. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a clinical answer, he said. It started clinical, she said. It didn't stay that way. The library was very quiet. The blossoms moved outside the window. He looked at her with those dark eyes that had stopped being unreadable to her somewhere around week 3, that she now read the way she read bodies. Not perfectly, not without uncertainty, but with the accumulated knowledge of close and consistent observation over time, with the understanding that the structure of him was particular and worth the learning. I don't have a practiced version of this, he said. I want to be precise with you. He paused, and she watched him navigate the unfamiliar territory of it, the man who didn't lie and didn't waste time finding himself in a situation where the words required were ones he'd had no occasion to use in 20 years. You changed the internal temperature of this compound by being in it, he said finally. You changed mine. I'm aware of where you are in a room without looking for you. I think about what you would say before I make decisions, not because I require external validation, but because your thinking is, it is useful, but that is not actually what I mean. He looked at her. You matter to me in a way that is not administrative, in a way that I don't have a practiced word for because I have not had cause to use one in a very long time. She held his gaze. She felt the weight of it land and settle, and she let it, didn't manage it away, didn't hold it at arm's length the way she held so many things. I know, she said quietly. I know you do. He looked at her and waited. I'm not going to pretend I haven't known what this was for a while, she said. I'm also not going to pretend that knowing what something is and knowing what to do with it are the same thing. She paused. You're not a simple situation. No, he said. I'm not. And I'm not someone who does things partially or casually. If I'm in something, I'm in it. I know that about you, he said. I have known that since the first morning in the kitchen. She looked at him. The cherry blossoms outside. The lamp on his desk throwing warm light across the books, and the surface she'd watched him put his hands on 100 times when he was thinking. The specific quality of the silence between them, which was not waiting for anything, was already something. Then we should probably figure out what we're doing, she said. Yes, he said. I think we should. The clinic opened on a Tuesday in late spring, 6 weeks after the night in Incheon. It occupied the ground floor of a building 3 blocks from the compound, in a neighborhood where the organization had legitimate property holdings. A quiet street, the kind of street that had a dry cleaner and a pharmacy, and a small restaurant that was open from 11 to 9 and played older music through its window. The clinic's sign was simple, a name, a caduceus, an address, nothing that announced what funded it or who stood behind it. Zuri had insisted on that. It helps people because it's good medicine, she'd said to Taehyun the week before opening, standing in the half-finished space with paint still drying on the walls. The moment it becomes an advertisement for anything else, it stops being what it needs to be. He'd looked at the space, the exam table, the supply shelves she'd organized herself, the waiting area with the chairs that were not institutional but weren't pretentious either, the kind of chairs that said, "You are welcome to be here without making a performance of it." "You did this," he said, not attributing anything else to it, just that. "We did this," she said. He looked at her, in the new paint smell of the clinic, in the thin spring light coming through windows that hadn't had anyone's hands on them yet. He looked at her the way she'd learned he looked at things he was deciding to keep. The first morning the clinic was open, 7 people came. 3 of them were women from a community of Vietnamese migrant workers whose settlement had no regular access to health care, referred through a network that Dong Hyun had quietly built over the preceding weeks. One was an elderly man who had been managing a wound infection for 3 weeks because he had no documentation and no money and nowhere else to go. 2 were children. Zuri worked until 7 in the evening. Her Korean nurse, hired with actual credentials and vetted properly, worked beside her with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for work that was worth doing. When she came out of the clinic at 7:15, Tae-hyun was there. Not inside. Outside, leaning against the car, which he'd driven himself. No driver, which he'd started doing on occasion, the small chosen normalcies of a man rebuilding his own life from its architecture outward. She looked at him in the evening light. He looked at her. "How was it?" he said. 14 patients, she said. "The wound infection is going to need a second visit tomorrow. The children both need follow-up vaccinations. Mrs. Park, one of the Vietnamese women, has hypertension she didn't know about." She paused. "It was good. It was real work." He nodded. She came to stand beside him, not quite touching, the specific careful distance of 2 people who are renegotiating their geography on a daily basis, and doing so with the patience the task required. "Rio sends his regards," Taehyun said. "How is his side?" "Healing. He says, and I quote, 'Training really does get real sometimes.'" She almost laughed. She felt it come up and let it out, and it was real, not managed, not constructed, and she felt him register it beside her with the particular attention he gave things he wanted to file away. She looked at the clinic door, the sign, the lit window behind which her nurse was completing end-of-day paperwork. "The Vietnamese families," she said. "I want to connect them to an immigration support organization. There's a legal aid group in Mapo Gu that does pro bono work for undocumented workers. Can Jiho look into whether we can—" "I'll ask him tomorrow," Taehyun said. She looked at him. "Just like that. Just like that." She held his gaze for a moment. "You know this is going to keep getting bigger," she said. "Once word moves through these communities that there's a clinic that doesn't ask for documentation, the number of people coming through that door is going to—" "I know," he said. "We'll need more space within a year." "I know. And more staff. And a proper pharmacy component." "Zuri," he said. She stopped. "I know," he said again, and it was different the 3rd time. Quieter, the word doing more work, covering the territory of yes, and I've already decided, and I'm not afraid of the size of it, she breathed. The evening was mild. The kind of soul spring evening that didn't argue with you, that just sat there being what it was. The city at its most livable. The light going gold over the buildings and the street coming alive with the particular 7 o'clock energy of a neighborhood finishing its day. Somewhere down the block, the restaurant was playing its older music through the window. She thought about Atlanta, about her mother at the kitchen table with the coffee going cold asking why Korea, and she thought about what she would say now if she had to answer that question, and she found the answer was more complex and more complete than it had been, was the kind of answer that couldn't be given in a kitchen because it required everything that had happened in the space between the asking and the knowing. She thought about Park Jae-won. She had last week located his wife through a careful intermediary and arranged for a monthly payment to come from one of the organization's legitimate financial structures. Not enough to undo anything, not enough to be anything other than what it was, which was an incomplete and imperfect acknowledgement of an incomplete and imperfect situation. She had not told Tae-hyun she was doing it. He'd found out anyway, through Jiho, and had said nothing to her about it except, one morning in the kitchen, to tell her the amount had been increased. She'd looked at him. He'd looked at her. They'd drunk their coffee. She thought about the cherry tree with the mended trunk, the resin worked into the fissure, the bark smooth over it. She thought about how the tree hadn't grown around the damage but through it, the damage not erased but integrated, the structure continuing upward with full knowledge of the break in it. She thought about all of this standing in the spring evening outside the clinic she'd built, and she felt the specific weight of her own life, its accumulated choices and costs and occasional graces, and found it heavier than it used to be and also more worth carrying. Tai Hyun was watching her. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Trees," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd learned was the closest he came to confusion. "The one in the compound courtyard," she said. "The one with the mended trunk." "I know the one." "Who fixed it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I did," he said, "years ago. A storm split it. I was told it wouldn't survive and to remove it." He paused. "I didn't want to remove it." She looked at him. "So you mended it," she said. "So I mended it," he said. She held his gaze in the spring evening light, the music from down the block moving through the air between them, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the end of difficulty, not the resolution of complexity or the erasure of darkness, or the arrival at a place where the cost of things stops being real. This is what it looks like. Two people with specific and unglamorous damage standing in a good piece of work they've made together, choosing to keep standing there, choosing it today and prepared to choose it tomorrow. No guarantees, no version of this that doesn't require the daily decision to continue. She closed the small distance between them and took his hand. His hand was warm. He didn't move at first. She felt the stillness of him, the old reflex of it, the 20 years of practiced distance. And then his hand closed around hers with a deliberateness that was not tentative, was not provisional, was the same quality he brought to every decision he actually committed to, which was the quality of a man who had decided and was not going to undecide. They stood like that for a while in the spring evening. The clinic light burned steady behind them. The street moved through its ordinary evening. The music from down the block played its older song through the window, and the city made its sounds and the light went slowly gold, and then softer than gold, and neither of them moved or spoke for a long time, because there was nothing that needed to be said right now that their hands weren't already saying. Down the block, the restaurant's window threw warm light onto the sidewalk. A woman walked past with a child on her hip, the child's head on her shoulder, both of them going home. The spring air moved through the street, and it was neither warm nor cold, but something in between, the exact temperature of a season in transition, and the cherry blossoms in the courtyard 3 blocks away were still on the trees, still holding on, white and brief and stubborn in the dark.